just keep your camera switched off. Otherwise, we're more than happy to see your face. And without much further ado, I want to welcome Lata Narayanaswamy. I have practiced. Lata is lecturer in international development at the School of Politics and International Studies at the Leeds University in the UK. And her research is very much interdisciplinary. She's drawing on development geography and social anthropology, on feminist and post-colonial theory. And she has focused on knowledge in the context of development and looked at how information moves, especially temporally, spatially, and looked at across transnationally emerging geographic and discursive spaces. And most recently, she has been giving talks at the universities of Sheffield and Oxford on research ethics, in particular from and with a decolonial lens. So we are looking forward to you sharing your ideas and your views on this topic, and maybe also some of the discussions that were had in Sheffield and Oxford. So, Lata.
Thank you, Julia. Can everybody hear me? I hope I'm clear. Yep.
Yes.
Great. It's so lovely to be here and doing this webinar, and thank you so much, Julia, for the opportunity and for all of you joining today to take time out of your day to join in the conversation. So I think that's worth reiterating. I want to just share some ideas and thoughts that I have been working through, and as Julia suggested, we discussed these issues in other contexts, like in Sheffield and Oxford, and talks I did recently, but I'm very keen to be able to engage with all of you, get some insights, and to have some good discussions afterwards. So what I'd like would be to spend the next 20 or so minutes thinking through this question of decolonial ethics. So what is the background to this idea? Why might this matter? But I'm particularly interested in a way in turning the lens on higher education. Some of you may have seen that Julia put up a blog that I did yesterday, and it's going to be trying to flesh out some of those ideas. Because I think in particular, the project of decoloniality does come up against real structural power and barriers. So it would be nice for us to think collectively about identifying them and then thinking through how we might address them. Okay, so just to start, I've been struck. I went to the Development Studies Association conference a couple of weeks ago in the UK, at the Open University, and Mahmoud Mamdani did the opening keynote, and he said something that I thought was extraordinary as a way of opening a development studies conference. So he said, development studies started as a critique of empire and has ended up as the language of empire. Development is the new civilizing mission. And this seemed like a real challenge for us in the room to then reflect on what we were doing, because I don't think I'm speaking, I do think I'm speaking for most colleagues, for quite a lot of colleagues who are engaged in development studies, that the issues that brought them there were questions around how we promote human rights or concerns around inequality. I've come across very few, if any, colleagues who engage in development studies that aren't motivated by a shared desire for the world to work better and for people's lives to get better. So this seemed an extraordinary moment where he was asking us to reflect critically. And I thought it was an opportunity for us to think through why a decolonial lens might matter in our discourse and our practice. Part of the challenge then, so I'd like to start then by thinking through the historical element of this. So part of the challenge is that the way we conceptualize development studies is, of course, the tendency to link the notion of development with a modernization project. And as many of us already know, that has a tendency to be very ahistorical in its approach. So Kapoor in 2004, drawing on a post-colonial tradition, suggests that structural adjustment and what he calls free trade policies of the Bretton Woods institutions proceed by a disavowal of the history of imperialism and the unequal footing on which such a history has often placed third world countries in the global capitalist system. So it is absolutely right that we think about how we can collectively address what we have now come to call global development challenges, but to do this in an ahistorical way would be a profound disservice to how history has brought us to the point that we're at, and the activists and freedom fighters and all of those activists and thinkers who actively fought the imposition of a particular type of imperial way of knowing. So we owe it, at least to them, to think through critically what we do and to whom and why it might matter. So if we can then reflect on the way in which the colonial project has culminated, so over 500 years, primarily, though not exclusively, European countries. We often think of the US in a sort of neo-colonial sense, a new kind of imperial project. And to think through then how this has an effect on the issues that we might want to focus on and the global development challenges that we seek to address. But part of that challenge then will sit within a set of frameworks and institutions that we exist within and we work within that also present unique challenges. So we want to be able, through our practice, to address the implications of colonialism now, but we often do that from a perspective of expertise. So the very ideas of development and poverty, so those things that we are actually aiming to address, are themselves what Lal, so I've got the book here actually, so this is actually an excellent book for anybody who hasn't read it. It's Vinay Lal's Empire of Knowledge. So I'm happy to sort of send it through the mailing list as a reference, but it's excellent. And he suggests that the very ideas of development and poverty with which economists, social planners, sociologists, and politicians in the non-Euro-American world work are sanctified by several generations of Western experts. So the challenge for us, the first challenge, is that whilst we may share goals of poverty alleviation, for instance, the colonial enterprise, the colonial project, has shaped power relations in a very particular way. So creating enduring perceptions of the primacy of the West as civilized or advanced, right, tied up with the project of modernity, against a backward or poor developing world. So in a way, one of the things that I think, and this is sort of turning the terminology on its head a little bit, but I think perhaps ironically that our discourse and practice has become decolonized in the sense that we have lost sight of that post-colonial legacy. So we talk about development as if colonialism never happened. So, and again, this might sound controversial in how it sounds, but I think it's about recolonizing. We need to actually put the colonialism back into our discussions, because we tend to talk as if those things either they happened and we acknowledge, but we don't really address the effects of them, or we actually pretend that that history doesn't matter. Because the fact that we see through the eyes and live by the rules of history's winners is not on its own surprising. For me, the greatest feat has been to convince us that the way we live is the natural course of things, that this is not one version of how the world might look, but the only inevitable version. So I think our starting point has to be a critical and reflexive approach to the assumptions that underpin academic perceptions. This is where we can look in the mirror and we can turn the lens on ourselves. And not because we're trying to put ourselves in the frame to the exclusion of other people, but if we wanted to actually make the contributions to addressing the global development challenges that so many of us are committed to making, that we do need to turn that lens on ourselves. And we need to think about what counts as knowledge, how we capture and communicate that knowledge, and who gets to both shape and present ideas as academic or expert knowledge. Once we've had to think through those issues, we can then consider what shape a decolonial ethics might take. So the starting point in thinking about the ways in which our own practice is implicated in reproducing some of these, I guess you could call them colonial frames, where sort of you have the primacy of the West, is the actual, the universalization of the Western framework. And again, Lal is really instructive here. He sort of suggests that far more so than Coca-Cola or Disney, it is the frameworks of knowledge encapsulated in the academic disciplines which have become universalized. And again, I think this is the legacy here about what education should look like, how it should be conducted. Not that the university itself is a Western construct. Indeed, it goes back millennia and has its roots in different parts of Asia. But the way in which we think of the university now, this question of disciplines and the tendency for those disciplines to then get siloed, so that we have sort of geographers and you have anthropologists, and then the way of knowing within that has become universalized. And what we get are lots of universities then trying to mimic those same structures. So there's never really any discussion or questioning of whether that kind of higher education is actually what is desirable to help and support and facilitate the kind of education that might contribute to addressing global development challenges. So then when we think of, so once we understand the ways in which we've had these universal knowledge systems, what might it mean to decolonize the curriculum? Because that's the other sort of buzzword at the minute, where everybody's talking about decolonizing the curriculum. And part of that is an acknowledgement of this tendency towards a universalization of the higher academic knowledge framework. So you might think, okay, well, decolonizing the curriculum, that's a good response. That's fair enough. Yeah, let's do that. Let's decolonize. And I think at some level, this is fair enough, right? So there is this sense that Christianity, civilization, development, liberal democracy. Robin Dunford has actually written, and again, I'm happy to share references. Maybe we can share references via email afterwards about the things that references I've talked about. But Robin Dunford has done a colleague based at the University of Brighton, done a really interesting paper on decolonial ethics. And he talks about the matrix of particular values. So this is a quote from him: Christianity, civilization, development, or liberal democracy that have been imposed on others as universal and globally applicable designs. Different, what he calls cosmovisions, ways of understanding the world, and different modes of living have been crushed, often violently, in the name of such particular perspectives masquerading as universal global designs. The best current examples, and I say this in the spirit of inquiry, not to undermine the collective effort entirely, but the SDGs are an excellent example of this sort of universal global design. It isn't to underestimate the fact that 100 some odd countries came together and signed up to anything. It is an extraordinary achievement, and it does give us quite a progressive blueprint in lots of ways. But it is underpinned by a sense that there is a shared set of values or perspectives and some particular trajectories that we might look for in what constitutes a good human life. And I think Dunford's point then is very, very important, because this idea that there might be what he calls different cosmovisions sort of becomes buried or invisibilized in our drive to try to define the global development challenges. And then we get this very linear way of thinking about what they are and then how we're going to solve them. Now, part of what underpins this question then of what informs our curriculum is what I've heard referred to even in my university, and I don't know if it's other parts, but certainly within the UK, that there are too many dead white men on the curriculum. Now, I think at some level, that's a fair enough point, right? So we have curricula, particularly in abroad, across the social sciences. International relations is particularly prone, but the reality is we're all probably guilty at some level of, having to think through Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, Michel Foucault. I mean, these are the theoretical bases for how we actually theorize within our own academic work. Now, this is true, and these are the ideas that underpin how we understand the forces that shape the world, including development and its associated challenges. So from that point of view, what we might call the canon, we probably can't afford not to teach it at one level. So then what does a decolonial approach to the curriculum look like? Because my concern with that approach, where we sort of say, oh, well, this is just a bunch of dead white men, is okay, well, how do we respond to that? And my worry is that we simply essentialize all white men. And anyway, those are all white men who don't all think the same thing. They're not all the same. And what we do instead is we think, okay, well, we're going to replace them with white women or brown or black men or women. And for me, I think a discussion point and something I'd love to hear from others about your approaches to decolonizing the curriculum if you've tried. But my worry is this, is that it's lazy. Because we need to move beyond thinking it's enough to simply change the race, gender, or status of the messenger, and instead raise more fundamental questions about the message. So this is much more about thinking through ideas. So it may be that that a decolonizing approach to a curriculum starts with what lots of people are calling the dead white men. But I think it's dangerous to think that we end there. We then have to think about ideas and views. Okay. And the other thing I would just highlight here is, and again, going back to Lal, sort of suggesting that we have a tendency to think about the Western knowledge framework as inherently open to inquiry. So he suggests, going back to the ancient Greeks, we sort of, Western knowledge frameworks sort of put forward this idea of what he calls the necessity of tolerance for dissenting frameworks of knowledge. But he would argue that, in fact, intellectual frameworks that dominate Western learning and the various academic disciplines are extraordinarily homogeneous. So we see ourselves in Western higher education as actually quite open to that sort of inclusive critique. It's one of the reasons that we value peer review, all these things that we do to keep the critique diverse. And I think to undermine that entirely is probably unfair. But the reality is that actually for new ideas to come into the discipline is actually, I think, much harder than maybe at first we're willing to acknowledge. So if we sort of take this as the backdrop, and we have this approach to thinking about the colonial sort of historical effects on the current knowledge frameworks in higher education, I wanted to now move to think more concretely about what that means for us in higher education. Okay, so, and this is what I'm calling how we know, in inverted commas, in higher education. And this is something I mentioned in my blog yesterday. And again, if anybody's read that and has any comments, they're always very, very welcome as part of the discussion. Because I'm here to learn as much as everybody else. So I just get the privilege of talking first. Okay, so the first thing I would say is that the language of our practice. And I mean this in two senses. The first is the literal sense, is that we function primarily in English. There is what some people in translation studies have called the post-colonial turn, and that's the attempt to make a more nuanced approach to meaning creation within translation to capture more diverse knowledges. But the reality is so many of the ideas, this webinar, the language of formulation and communication is most often English in the first instance. And I have to say, and I find this an absolutely extraordinary thing that goes widely uncommented on. So we'll talk a lot about that, say in fieldwork, and I'll talk about fieldwork and ethics in a minute. But we talk a lot about language and the fact that, maybe we need to translate things into local languages. But I am so struck by how many colleagues I meet from all over the world whose first language is not English. And I'm at conferences and I'm at you know, meetings or whatever, Skype calls, whatever. Nobody seems to wonder why the default is just English. It's just what we do. And I think we just need to step back and ask what the effects of that are in terms of how we create and disseminate ideas. The other thing I would say is just to reiterate this point about the universalization of Western frameworks. Certainly there is a transnational elite kind of function that means that certain types of ideas, for instance, the ones that we might associate with the SDGs, for instance, that then proliferate across different spaces, but not just from the global north to the global south, that you might actually get elite systems within global south contexts that we need to be mindful of. So it's not enough to just say we're going to have global south participation. We have to be more critical about what that means and why it matters. And building on that, I would say that there is a tendency then to respond to the sort of the decolonizing efforts with this tendency to homogenize. So we'll see global South stakeholders through monolithic categories. So you have global South feminists, and you have global South activists, and you have global South practitioners and global South academics. And these are monolithic categories. And this tendency to essentialize or homogenize has been a key concern for many development feminists. But in my own work, I would suggest that in fact, the term global South has become a signifier of an imagined geography of exclusion. And it doesn't really account for inequalities or elite practices in global South contexts. I think we need to problematize this. We need to think about this in more depth. Then if we take all of the backdrop, we think about what decolonizing means. And now we've thought a little bit about our practice. I'd like now to turn to the final point I want to make, which is the institutional structure. The reality is that higher education is incredibly hierarchical. It's professionalized, particularly in the context of the modern university. We are incentivized much more to be competitive than we are collaborative, and we privilege notions of expertise. And I've been in those academic review meetings where my head of school is saying to me, okay, so what are you going to be an expert in? What is that thing you're going to be known for? And in some ways, I find that deeply problematic because, as I might want to elevate what I'm calling my own expertise, I think in that process, the views and ideas on which my own work is built actually invisibilize the work of others. And I would much rather think of myself as somebody that, I think the notion of expertise has an arrogance that I think sits uncomfortably. And I think we need to interrogate that a bit further, but it's hard because we're incentivized to do that. The other thing, of course, is the politics of development research in itself. So this is the politics of how we do research, the ways in which in higher education we validate knowledge, and how this is done. And somebody at the DSA pointed out 2 weeks ago, we've noticed in the first sets of funding, because there's a big Global Challenges Research Fund that's been made available by the UK government. And apparently in this first review, what we can see is a disproportionate amount of money has gone to science and technology. And no surprise there, right? Because what that allows us to do is science is very good at tangible things. I dig wells, I put up satellite dishes. Infrastructure is very popular. I built a school, I built a clinic, I put in an X-ray machine. These are things that make my value for money tangible. This is how I spent the money. See this thing I did, right? And the science is about saying, well, here's a problem. Here is my technology science solution. And actually, we need to be able to see not just the problems, but how we interact with them and any potential impacts. Even science, these are not neutral and objective technocratic things. They're overtly political and interpretive processes. The other thing I would highlight is the way we are encouraged, and actually we have to write into our research bids that we're going to print up stuff in peer-reviewed publications. These are behind paywalls. Invariably, all the high-impact journals are also in English, and we're siloed by subdisciplines. So that business of how we come together across disciplines to solve problems becomes much harder because it's difficult to work across disciplines. So I'll end on this question then, and then thinking about ethics, and then it would be great to open up to discussion, because what does all this mean for ethics? Well, I think the takeaway message for me, so again, I've got an example of a good book and I've used it in my own work. There's a very common example, you know, research methods in the social sciences, right? So this is the book you refer to when you're filling in your ethics application and you're ready to go to the field, right? You've had all those meetings with the supervisors, you've sat down, you've worked it through, I've got my research questions, right? I'm off to the field study. And assuming that you're going to talk to another human being, you've got to fill out an ethics process, and that has to go to a committee. And I think this is where the starting point is completely wrong. The focus is placed narrowly on how data collection processes interact with people. And quite rightly, we're interested in harm, consent, privacy, and the confidentiality of data. In that, even though there's been some movement using feminist kind of epistemology to think about ourselves as not just neutral observers, but, you know, implicated in the research process, the reality is when it comes to ethics, we are casting ourselves as neutral observers. And we only have to think about it when we're going to go into the field. But actually, the whole process, I think, should be subject to ethics. Are we the right people to be asking the question in the first place? How do we decide whether that's the right question even to ask? And, you know, I'm amazed, for instance, at the wide range of activities that get tacked on to a research process. So I have to say, I'm going to go into this field, I'm going to interview that person, I'm going to do this focus group, I'm going to observe those people working in that company. But the fact is, only the bit labeled the field study is subject to ethical scrutiny. So who I invite to my follow-up workshop, how I write up my impact case study, where I publish my findings, none of that is subject to ethical considerations by a panel or anyone else. And I think that's something that we need to step back. Maybe we need to collectively be pushing our institutions to think more dynamically about ethics. And I would say that this is actually as important whether you work in a developing or developed country context, in whatever way those labels are meaningful. So what do? So we need to continuously reflect on the range of voices, views, and ideas we seek out. We need to consider the implications of our methodological choices, how we choose to codify and represent other people's views. We need to look at the assumption that underpin our choices and the power relations that legitimize them. So when we seek out those local voices, these are not people that exist in a vacuum elsewhere. They are interacting with us and they live in the same world that we live in. And we need to think about how our life worlds will interact and what that means for knowledge creation. So for me, in terms of a discussion point, my starting point would be, you know, how do we think about ethics more dynamically, more holistically across the entire research process? And what would an ethical process look like if our starting point was asking, how do we listen? You know, what does a decolonial ethics look like if our starting point was looking at the entire research process, and instead of the usual research questions, what would it look like if we were listening? So I'll stop there, and it would be really great then to hear from other people's experiences, and for all of us to be able to learn from that. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lata. I think you've given us plenty of points to discuss. So everyone, please feel free to join in. And Suming, I see your hand. Do you want to comment or go first?
Okay, have I unmuted my thing? Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. So thanks, Lata. Sorry I was a tiny bit late. I was mindlessly drinking coffee in some corner of the university and realized right that 3 p.m. was 2 p.m. The usual
time zones is another
usual time zone dysphoria that we have. So yeah, so I'll start with the last point really, which is how do we get ethics all the way down?
Yeah.
And then where do we position the decolonial ethics in relation to the development ethics?
Mm.
And how do we put the decolonial, so is it a matter of putting all the development ethics into one big decolonial ethics, or getting the decolonial ethics to go all the way down into the development ethics, and getting the development ethics to go all the way down? And I'm just thinking, I just partly reviewed this new Handbook of Development Ethics, which is is it a Routledge or an Oxford handbook? I don't even remember. It's edited by Jay Drydick and Laurie Kelleher.
Okay.
So it's a large resource, and I have some article that I published fairly recently. I think it was in Policy and Practice, which is this kind of open online, no prestige journal that we founded 10 years ago to have a kind of a discussion and to have a forum of discussion and debate that would be relevant just for Ireland, North and South, but it's quite a global thing. So it's called Policy and Practice of Development Education Review. And it was really supposedly looking at the humanitarian security nexus in development. But really, the point of that article was, where does development ethics come in? Because in development studies, it was all about getting development to get onto the security bandwagon.
Yep.
Which in a kind of very, quite blatantly unethical perspective.
Yeah.
Right? In a very instrumental, development's going all humanitarian. Organizations which used to not be humanitarian organizations are now prevailing in the humanitarian organizational space. Long-standing development organizations that used to say we're not humanitarian, we're a development organization, had started to say, oh, we're in the humanitarian business now. And what I argued was quite similar, I think, to what you're saying, which is, where is ethics?
Yeah.
It's not just in some bit of the how to operationalize your research tick box area, even though we have to do that. And the answer is not in your standard ethics section of your research methods textbook. You need a better set of resources which would have the big picture going down to a smaller picture. And I do think that, so Jay and Laurie are very active in the International Development Ethics Association. Jay is the new incoming president of the Human Development and Capabilities Association. So they kind of are quite long-standing pivot points in the ethics thematic group within human development and capabilities. So I'd say this is one of the long-standing areas where development studies can engage with ethics, because it has been doing this from Amartya Sen onwards. But most of the development community is not very madly keen on it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, Suming, is it possible after we've done to just circulate some of the, you've talked about a couple of references.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll add that.
So when we're finished, if you're able to sort of
the article which has other articles
and then we can circulate. That's perfect. That's great.
I'm happy to share.
Yeah, but so that's really all I really think I want to say, which is that, but there's a piece that is about doing development, and then there's a piece which is about higher education and its role. Because higher education's role is not to do development, it's to do research about development, to have a field of critical study that we might call development studies, to do educational activities with respect to these fields of study. And studying and fields are not the same as development. So the field of development studies is not the same as the field in which we do development intervention.
Well,
so these are kind of different things. Sorry, Julia.
Yeah, if I may chip in, because I think that also feeds very well into what Lata said about, well, can we not just listen instead of, because I think it's a structural thing. It's about who funds the research. And if I've recently looked at, different development research funders across Europe, they explicitly say, you say as development scholars, we are not there to do development, but development funders, if you look at some of their mission statements and a couple of their funding guidelines, they're looking for, not for research on development, they're looking for research for development or research as development. So that's very specifically research, not as the detached thing. So, and I think it's very, all the points Lata has raised, they're very much connected to the structural issue of who's funding the research.
Yeah.
I mean, ideally, I would be going, somewhere and listen and say, what you want me to bring to the table from my qualifications, from what I can bring, and then let's develop the questions together rather than me going somewhere with pre-developed questions, which my supervisor has signed off, so and so and so.
Mm.
So let's develop that together, then let's develop who can contribute what, then let's develop who can write what, etc., etc., etc. But that's not how the reality of funding works, because Lata has referred to the GCRF. I think its requirement that the British institution is holding the funds. So, and then it's the requirement that results are published in certain publications based in certain publishers, certain journals, etc., etc. So I think that's very much beyond the individual of us thinking critically about how we engage and how we do things. It's a very structural thing.
But it's also about having an intervention where we clarify who we are and what the purpose of this knowledge is, because even the funders themselves are not very clear about why they fund knowledge creation, what the different purposes are, who the different beneficiaries are, who are in the intended beneficiaries. And it's always constructed in these Global Challenges Fund or whatever, as if we know who the beneficiaries are. They're the people who are over there. But at the same time, there is an aid modality that says the beneficiaries are our universities over here.
Mm-hmm.
So the relationship between over there and over here is rightly, it's about ethics of what is the relationship, what are the motivations and the roles, and on what grounds are there inclusions or exclusions, and what is considered to be a legitimate or an effective way of going about doing that role. So I don't think any of these things are fixed or given. So absolutely, I agree that that's not what the funders want. But I'm saying that the funders are not necessarily very clear about what it is they want and for whom.
Mm-hmm.
So part of critical collaborative is to ask for greater clarity on these things, and to help to clarify and make intelligible the different kinds of roles, responsibilities, expectations, and how these relate to critiques and interventions. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different pieces of work there with lots of people running around doing them. But they're not all one person doing one thing.
Sorry to interrupt you. I also want to give others opportunity to join in, because I see Anik has said she's discussion point. So maybe you want to come in.
Hi, Anik.
Anik, if you're there.
I'm muted. I'm here. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Lata, and I also apologize for my lateness. I, like Su-Ming, was distracted by the afternoon. I feel that the points that are being made are so pertinent and so precise. And I've got just a few things I want to ground in order to perhaps just share an ongoing discussion point. So the first is, I think, Su-Ming, you've really accurately framed this in terms of the positioning decolonial ethics in relation to development ethics, and the in-between space of studying and fields. And as some background, Lata, in a way, I'm coming from that space in that I'm not a traditional academic. I don't have a traditional academic background, and I do not engage in a scientific methodology, whether it be social sciences or otherwise. So the place I'm coming from sits between a very strong commitment to that, because I come without a conditioning that comes with the Western colonial institution. And at the same time with a great fear and insecurity in terms of not being able to be rigorous enough in the way that I approach very, very real, raw, precarious, essential decolonial work. That's the first thing. The second is in terms of expertise, I wholeheartedly agree. And one of the projects I was lucky enough to do that I developed independently but then received some funding to practice was a technique called the public panel relay. I think Suming and Sayan have heard about this, but its intention is to dismantle hierarchies of authority, where you cannot actually tell the difference between who is a member of the public that stepped up into a panel and who is an actual invited expert on a particular topic. And the first time I did this was actually with genocide scholars ranging from the Armenian genocide, Roma genocide, First Nations in Canada, and members of the public. And it was very powerful. So I think we have an opportunity to look at new techniques and technologies that open up these spaces of critical collaborative work that can sit within existing institutional structures but bend them and stretch them. The other thing I wanted to say was I really love your point about listening, and this is where I'm coming from. The most academic work I've done was actually in process philosophy, which is where the process leads. And so where I kind of ground myself in this work is by trying to listen to the process and letting it tell me what is necessary. Now, right now, thanks to Sayan, I'm collaborating with on a book chapter for his Myth and History in Post-Colonial Consciousness book, and I'm collaborating with a 14-year-old Indigenous Australian woman who I invited. She's a family friend who I invited to co-author this piece with me. And it's absolutely fascinating. It's I'm shit scared because I'm meant to be leading a rigorous process that sits between kind of decolonial research and development, because she's coming at it from her main driver is the high Indigenous youth suicide rate in Australia, and that she wants young Indigenous people to feel a sense of belonging with their indigeneity and with themselves. Right. And so for me, what I'm trying to listen to at the moment, in the same way you, Julia, were talking about the funding can really drive, you know, where this is coming from. What I'm trying to listen to is the need, in the sense, in that context, but the need as articulated by the quote unquote development context, if you will, but that it's not only a development context because we're all in the study together. So just to finish, I think my main kind of, I wanted to share that kind of my areas of work as related, but just to finish, I think, you know, my question is how can we continue to open up these critical, collaborative, decolonial spaces in ways that sit between you know, existing methodologies for doing ethical work, but that, yes, listen to what the ethics is in that situation, but that make it accessible for people like me, for people like my collaborator, my 14-year-old collaborator, such that we can feel like we are being responsible in the work that we're doing. Yeah, that's about it.
I'm happy to respond, but I don't want to monopolize. So is there anybody else that wants to come back on any of that?
I just think it sounds, the chapter sounds great. So
Yeah.
I'll be keen on reading it once you finish it. But no, Lata, go ahead.
But Sayan, I can see you. Did you want to come in on this?
Well, my exact comment is not on Annie's point. Yes, because I mean, there's not much to comment because in both the examples she has cited is like weird collaborative projects. So yes, we are working on 2 collaborative projects, one with Professor Suming as well, where there's a question of in-betweenness, how to move away from this binary. We are always creating a binary of colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, how to shed off those lashes and kind of create a space for in-betweenness. And also the second, obviously, I'm very excited for the paper, the chapter to receive from Anik and the young lady from Australia, I guess. And but I was actually wondering to share something with respect to your talk, the different perspectives that you have once again put forward with respect to the question of decolonizing the curriculum. We have been like talking in this, especially in this Convivial Thinking platform, for the last few months, like through lectures, and at the same time, especially the reading sessions have been so much centered on this particular perspective. Just one example. I mean, while I was listening and I was thinking how this task is so very challenging in the Indian context. I mean, obviously a major issue in the Indian perspective with respect to decolonial thinking and doing is like, it's very scattered. It's very scattered. You don't find this collaborative thing. For instance, if you visit a state like Kerala, where you find like basically most of the collaborative works, especially in their local native tongue, is going around. It's very prominent in Kerala, but otherwise in the other states, it's highly questionable. The second point is, few days back, I was a part of the orientation program, and that particular orientation program was about the present university in which I am teaching in New Delhi. They wanted to give a brief to most of the new faculties who were inducted, and I was also the part of that group. And they wanted to give an idea about the university, and basically they wanted to give an idea. Basically, they wanted to advertise why their university is really good and why it should be chosen over other universities and so on and so forth. Few points really, I mean, disturbed me a lot. The first is their blind fetishism towards US universities. So they were so happy, they were so proud to say that how they are copying the university syllabus, the US university syllabus. They're so proud to say that they have a team in the university where I teach is Amity University right now, and they have this entire team associated, a US team associated with the university, who yearly visits the university to appreciate them, that how well they are copying the US university system, and they're proud to share it. The second point is, I mean, that was really quite shocking for me. They say that only 2 valid databases which are approved in their university system, and it's also not only in their university system, across right now it's happening in India, is like Scopus and the Web of Sciences. So only Scopus and the Web of Sciences are the only 2 valid databases, and across the world there exists no other valid databases. Okay, so if your paper is not indexed in Scopus, so the second is a kind of Scopus fetishism which is coming up in right now in India across every university. So it is like, if your paper is not indexed in Scopus, it means your paper is not valid, your arguments are not valid. Point number 2. Point number 3 is, they were talking about the university, but they hardly mentioned the term university. They hardly mentioned the term students. They hardly mentioned the term faculties. What they were doing is, they were talking about industry. They were talking about consumers. They were talking about customers. They were talking about sellers. So that was really very problematic for me. And they were like talking like industrialists. At one point of time, I felt that I'm not sitting inside a university. I felt that I'm sitting inside an industry. So these points really somewhat made me feel that a place where mimicking the Western system, or specifically the US academic system, a place where a kind of colonial capitalist notion of running a university like an industry is made, it's really a very challenging task on the practical basis. Going back, in fact, to your question, that how easy it is to decolonize the curriculum, which you have, in fact, raised in some of your previous writings and lectures as well. I mean, it's a very challenging task, doubtless. I mean, we shouldn't stop. We should keep on struggling. But when you sit in this practical space and when you try to connect it with the theories and the philosophies and the arguments, it's sometimes a mismatch as well. So this is like, I thought sharing with you when I was listening to your lecture, these perspective really hit me a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is it okay, Julie? I mean, is there anybody else that wants to comment? There's a couple of things I want to say, but as I said, I'm really not keen on monopolizing.
Well, there's so far not in the chat. No one has.
Okay.
Raised
Okay.
hand.
Okay. So there's a couple of things. The first thing I would say, so just I wanted to respond sequentially. Sort of, thank you first of all. It's been really enlightening to hear all of your different perspectives. Just to go back to first, Suming, I think you're quite right, because I think the danger. So at one level, I agree in the sense that I think the danger of saying that critical development studies should be separate from the practice of development. I think as a principle, that's quite right, because we do need to be able to separate ourselves. Some of the theorizing we're doing around decolonizing, in a way, would become undermined if we were saying that we were development practitioners. However, and it goes back to Julia's point, and I think it's a point that I think I made, but I probably should have made more explicitly, and Julia's highlighted it really helpfully. And that is that we are existing in a system where we are being incentivized to be development practitioners, even as academics. That's the first thing. The other thing, though, is that I had an interesting conversation with somebody at UNICEF. This is the UN. This is UNICEF. This is an organization with offices all over the world. They have, whatever we might call links to the communities, to grassroots, however we're going to label them, working in every country. And when I said, okay, so, where do you get your information? I said, well, mainly we use peer-reviewed academic publications. And I just find that extraordinary. I just thought, how is it possible that the UN, with the kind of global presence that it has, relies on English-speaking academia? So I think by definition, we become implicated as development practitioners, even if we might actively reject the label. So I think we do have some responsibility to think about then. So I think it's quite good if we can, do that, but and continue to be critical and to separate them out. I just wonder whether in reality that separation is even if it's possible, I wonder how often those lines are getting blurred. And certainly with a lot of this, what this global challenges kind of funding that's coming up in lots of places, not just the UK, I think those lines are getting blurred more and more. This question of how you work with Indigenous groups, I mean, the counterpoint to that, and this may be a little bit controversial for some, but I remember one journalistic commentator in the UK made the point. She had done some investigative reporting, and she had some pushback. And she was kind of going undercover, doing working class jobs. This is Polly Toynbee, for anybody who reads the UK papers. And somebody pushed back and said, why do you have to do that? Why aren't you just interviewing those people so they can speak for themselves? And it's a valid question. But her response was, because people will listen to me and they won't listen to them. So there is also something about, how we use our power. So for her, this was about, she can bring a middle class coding, as it were, and amplify issues that otherwise people don't listen to, because there are those class divides that can be manifested as knowledge divides. We might not want to see them that way, but that's so, who you listen to, and that might be us approaching decoloniality, working with the grain of the system. I'm not saying I think that's a great idea, but it is a perspective that it's something I think we need to think about. And finally, Cyan, I'm not surprised at all about the university thing. I think Stacey Pigg did a really nice thing in 1992 when she was talking about Nepal and notions of Bikashi. So So this idea that, so Bikash in Nepali was the term for development, and people were more developed than their neighbors. So, you know, oh, I'm more Bikash than my neighbor down the road who's kind of, you know, and this idea of development is aspirational, right? And I grew up I'm Canadian, right? And I'm South Asian origin, and I grew up in a diaspora community. And there is no question, anecdotally anyway, that the West, I think that might be diminishing a little bit, but the West is aspirational. And the fact that you might mimic the West is aspirational. I don't think it's not everything, but I think there is some element of that business of a Western knowledge framework as something that you value and mimic because, you know, it has some sort of intrinsic value, or that there's something that could be good about that. And I talk about USPs and stuff like that at work. So I feel your pain, Sayan, I really do. But I think there is something about, then what does a decoloniality look like? You know, how are people engaging if actually what they want to do is to be more like the West? What is the response then? You know, what does a decolonial ethic look like in that context? But I'll leave it there because I think these are things that we could probably discuss for days and days.
Adrienne wanted to make a comment, so.
Hi, thank you. I'm new to this group, but I'm so glad to have found it. I'm a graduate student. Oh, sorry, the bell is gonna ring. I'm a graduate student in France, but I'm originally from the US. And so conversations about ethics, the system here is very different. And I feel like the university is still very reticent to have these conversations openly. I was part of my school's very first ethics class for anthropology graduates this year. So that was an interesting experience. But I just had a comment when during the talk you were talking about global South and criticizing that point for the, you know, the totalitizing nature of that and basing it on geography. And I had a professor this year who used the term, his name is Philippe Lavigne-Delville, and he takes the term originally from Hubert de Midi, the term country under pays sous régime d'aide, so country under the aid policy, aid regime, and opposes that to an enriched country. Of course, we can criticize the fact that it creates a divide where there are many nuances that need to be brought, but I think it's interesting to put that back in instead of saying the South and the North, whereas we know very clearly that the geography is not a strict delineation and it has little to do with geography in itself. It's more complicated than that. But anyway, I just wanted to propose those terms. I think that they're interesting, and I think it's an interesting perspective that is starting to take some hold here in French development anthropology, though our treatment of colonial issues is not nearly taken as seriously or taken as frontally as I believe it should be, but it is present. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrienne. That's really helpful. I think the only thing I would say very, very quickly is that we're also getting more blurred lines because some aid receiving countries are aid giving now. So, you know, South Africa receives aid and gives it. India is receiving aid. So the BRICS in particular, we're getting these really sorts of, the labels are just becoming less and less explanatory. So I take your point that there's probably something important if you're an aid receiving country. But to flip that on its head, my enduring frustration is that we don't use the language of development to talk about our context at all. So to give an example, there's lots and lots of stuff in the news in the UK about an increase in food bank use. So why aren't we using the language of food security? Why aren't the lessons of food security from development studies being used to talk about the fact that in the UK, because of a car-oriented culture and certain types of urban planning, that you're getting food deserts where people cannot buy or even afford fresh fruit and vegetables? That is a food security issue. And how that's linked to employment and falling wages. Those are discussions we have in development studies all the time, and it just doesn't, we never ever use that language to talk about ourselves. So the decolonial element can be also turning that lens sorry, not the lens, the language on ourselves, which also we're reluctant to do, which is also part of the development studies epistemology, reinforced by circumscribing something as development studies, right? So now we have, and Julia's more eloquent on this than I am, so probably should comment, but just that business of saying we have something called development studies, and because we've said it's this thing, it only applies to this or this place or aid or something like that, and we can't use that language to talk about ourselves at all, which I think is a limitation, and we could reflect on that as well.
Well, even despite the fact that the SDGs kind of demand that you know, development is happening everywhere, and I was recently, because you can actually, or at least in Germany, you can look up for the different goals, you can look up the figures, and in the city I live, I was really, I mean, I was looking at the analphabet rate, and it's 10% in the city I live. And that's, I mean, that's, as you say, that's an issue of development.
Yeah.
I mean, we're praising ourselves as, you know, highly educated, highly developed, highly whatever, but 10% is quite a lot of people who cannot read and write.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So I'm conscious of the time, so I want to give someone who still hasn't spoken or wants to bring another point, give the opportunity to talk. Victoria?
Hello, can you see me? No. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you though.
Can't probably see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Well, nice to see all of you. Thank you for creating this space. So my name is Victoria. I'm a PhD student actually at the University of Sheffield, but I'm in Accra where I'm doing my field research activities. And so I wanted to say, just first of all, sorry I had to miss your participation in the decolonial ethics workshop, Lata, but I heard it was really nice.
Yeah,
but I think a lot of the things that everyone is mentioning is also making me think quite a lot about like the ethics through which how we do collaborative research, how we work with others generally, what we recognize as knowledge, and then also how we represent this, right? So I used to live, I'm doing my research in Accra because I'm Nigerian American, but I lived in Accra for a number of years before starting my PhD. And so when I wanted to do my PhD, I wanted to do collaborative research, and I wanted to try to find ways to work with some of the individuals I'd worked with before doing my PhD. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm working with an NGO that's here in Accra. But it's been really interesting because I think in many ways, we've been trying to find ways, I mean, it's not always possible, but trying to find ways to balance sort of what's our accountabilities, what are we even doing with this research based on my accountability being within a university, their accountability being within a community, in a neighborhood. And I'm working in a neighborhood where it's very much, as I say, over research. A lot of people come and they do research. They come, they do their research, they gain information, they leave, they now, publish their peer-reviewed article in other spaces. So we'd even tried to do something recently where we did a community engagement event that we wanted to do it specifically as a way of representing the knowledge that we've been learning through this process within the community. We'd interview different individuals. How do we also report back or share or create a space in which the information that we're learning is not just available, but it's also it's shared in ways that are applicable to this community. But I think there's a couple of things also that I wanted to just mention, which is, one, I think being in a city like Accra, which I think is like many cities in that, I think many of us have talked about these distinctions that are made between the global north, quote, the global north, quote, the global south. Mm-hmm. And I think it's incredibly important that we continue to problematize this, because I think Accra is like Lagos, is like a lot of African cities where, the whole of Ghana is sort of referred to as the global south, but the whole of Ghana is not global south, like there's, if you travel, my family's from Nigeria, and if you travel to cities like Lagos, you'll see, I've seen more richness and wealth in Nigeria than I've seen in the US, and so how do we also complicate this in a way that we understand spaces and transnational connections and all of this, you know? But then also I was just thinking about, I think in a lot of the decoloniality literature talks about decolonial work as, it's thinking work, it's also doing work. And I just wanted to speak to how, I mean, it's difficult, right? Like we read texts, we think ideas, we have these grand ideas, but then when you're in the space where you're doing the research and you're having conversations and you're trying to make things more balanced and you're trying to listen, but it's also, I mean, it's, as we know, research is an encounter, right? Especially when you're engaging with other people, and it's not just you can only decolonize yourself in many ways, but we're also working with other individuals who themselves are operating within systems that have their own histories and challenges and things like that, that impact how they see us and then how they engage with us, And so specifically, I'm talking about, there's a conference that's coming up, and it's in the city of Accra. Actually, it's Friday. But we have been working together on the presentation, and even just this process of trying to work together on an academic quote presentation. Yeah. I think it's interesting how I have to remind myself not to push them so hard, because sometimes it's not the space in which people are interested in necessarily participating. It's not the space where people are particularly comfortable, but at the same time, I think in many ways we see that it's important to sort of challenge that a little bit. But also in terms of, I wanted to ask, I've just started to try to look into different ways that we represent collaborative research. I know obviously co-authorship, but also other ways as well. And I just wanted to ask if there's any resources you have on that, because it's something that I've been thinking about in terms of how to represent. They're not always going to be interested, and they're not interested in, writing, co-authoring peer-reviewed articles, but also to how to represent this, how to take their insights and their own theorizing, which I'm trying to do. There's a number of ways, their observation and insights that I think are theorizing. I'm trying to represent it as such. But what are different ways to do that, I think, in especially very hierarchical academic spaces? Thank you.
I mean, I'm happy to come back on that point if nobody else wants to respond. I don't know how much more time we have. But I think, Victoria, so it's really lovely to hear from you, and sorry that you couldn't join us even virtually last week, and it was good, and I did enjoy being there. So it'd be great to connect with you when you're back in the country. But on your point about sort of linking with people, I mean, one of the things, and I'll share it, I'll make sure that we can share with the community. So there's a special issue of the Gender Development Journal that I'm co-editing, and one of the contributions is also from an early career PhD researcher, and really raising questions about the ethical gold standard of anonymity, right? So this idea that actually we sort of take, you're sort of describing going into Accra or Lagos, and people just go in and they collect their data, and that gets turned into, they collect the information that gets turned into data for their study, and actually it strips people of the ownership of their voice in that study. And she's saying, she sort of describes her experience of doing her PhD, and she's going into the field, and people are like, I don't want you to appropriate my voice. This is my NGO, this is my activism, and I want you to name me. And also it's good for my organization, or it's good for my feminist activist voice if you actually name me in your research, because then it's me, it's my voice, it's not just some random voice. And so, but that, that our starting point is anonymity, but what are the consequences for that in terms of how we codify and appropriate knowledge? But also in terms of how you actually do this, and this is a plug for an upcoming webinar in the autumn, but the person to ask is Risha Nagar, I think, because she has made this kind of working her life's work. And anything you read by her, the immediate impression is that it's incredibly hard. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it, but when you sort of, so the best book, I don't know if you've already seen it, Victoria, but it's called Playing with Fire. So she published this in 2007, and it's excellent bedtime reading, because and again, we can add it to this list of resources that we send around after today, But what she describes is actually exactly what you're saying you want to do, which is you want genuine engagement. You feel that you have a place of privilege within a Western academic context that gives you an outlet to certain types of spaces. But you don't want to appropriate people's voices, and you want to be aware of the power relation. So then what do you do, right? That's my positionality. Then what do I do? And this book describes a process. It's sort of bookended by 2 academic-y chapters. And then the middle of this book is, and it was anonymized only because of the threats to the lives of these women from this organization that they were critiquing, that they had worked with. And basically she's gone into this community, and they've set up this kind of activist collective and trying to think through how they tell their life stories, and all sorts of fantastic things come out of that. So I can't recommend that book highly enough. You know, these women who sort of say, look, you keep coming and talking to us about our empowerment and our engagement with this local community, as if big concepts like globalization don't have anything to do with us. But I have a view on globalization. How come you're not asking me? You know, this kind of stuff. It's just, yeah, really, really, really inspiring. So, you know, she's somebody whose work you can tap into. And she's published disproportionately in geography journals, because she's kind of crosses kind of geography and cultural studies in the US. So she's at the University of Minnesota.
So unfortunately, looking at the time, we're already quarter of an hour over, but I think Lata, you already kind of took away my my last words. And because I actually wanted to say, because we also raised the point of, are we development practitioners? And I think that also very much adds to the question of scholarly activism, and how much, I think the point was also raised, how much is scholarship neutral, or how much is it politically engaged? And then again, we arrive at the point you made about recolonizing, about making the whole engagement political rather than technical question for us to solve. So yeah, definitely. We have the session with Risha Naga coming up end of October, 31st of October, and we'll have a reading circle before, and actually read some of the texts you just mentioned, and then be able to discuss them with Risha. So definitely something to bookmark. And I already see in the chat that there are a lot of engagement, collaboration going on between you. So that's I think that's as far as we can get today, rather than, you know, solving all the questions that were raised. But we'll keep discussing. We'll keep being connected. Lata, thanks so much for taking the time, for giving us this input. Everyone else, thanks very much for joining and for giving your views and your points to the discussion. And we really hope you'll keep in touch. As said, please bookmark the upcoming dates. There's Gominda Bambra on the 18th of September and Risha Naga on the 31st. And